The universe was vast, cold, and mostly silent until the day the Krell decided to claim the Orion Arm. The Krell were not like humans. They were ancient biological masters of the stars who believed that speed was the only way to survive. Their ships were not built for comfort or endurance. They were thin, elegant needles of glass and coherent light, capable of crossing star systems in a matter of hours. They looked at the third planet of a small, unremarkable yellow sun, Sol, and saw nothing but a resource node, a target to be catalogued and neutralized. They did not expect to find a city in their path. The Bastion was not a ship in any conventional sense. It was a statement, a declaration written in tons of ferrous metal. 5 miles deep and 10 miles wide, it was a giant slab of iron, lead, and reinforced steel, shaped more like a flattened coin than any vessel of exploration. It didn't have engines meant for racing or elegant maneuvering. It had engines meant for moving a continent. Massive fusion thrusters that burned with the fury of a small star. When it first appeared from the perpetual shadow of Earth's moon, sliding out from its berth like a waking leviathan, the Krell's advanced sensors malfunctioned in sheer astonishment. Their quantum processors couldn't understand how something so large, so impossibly massive, could stay together in the vacuum of space without collapsing under its own unimaginable weight. But humans had learned a long time ago that when you live in a hostile galaxy, you don't just build a home, you build a shield, and you make sure that shield is thick enough to absorb the fury of gods. Captain Var of the Krell Vanguard, a being who had personally overseen the subjugation of a dozen civilizations, ordered the first strike without hesitation. 1,000 beams of focused plasma, each one hot enough to vaporize a city, lanced across the void and hit the front hull of the Bastion. On any other ship in the known galaxy, this onslaught would have melted the crew instantly, turning the interior into a plasma-charred tomb. On the Bastion, it barely warmed the outer layers of the secondary armor plates, creating a faint, cherry-red glow that faded as quickly as it appeared. Inside the city, life continued with a mundane indifference that was, in itself, a profound act of defiance. People were drinking coffee in automated cafes, going to work in zero-gravity factories, and watching the news on holoscreens embedded in their apartment walls. The war, the greatest existential threat humanity had ever faced, was just a slight, rhythmic vibration in the floor, easily ignored like the hum of an air conditioner. This was the true, unspoken strength of humanity, the psychological resilience, the stubborn ability to live a normal life while the world outside was on fire. Admiral Sarah Reed, a woman whose face was a map of old scars and colder calculations, watched the Krell fleet from the central hub, a transparent orb that jutted from the Bastion's top like a glass eye. She didn't see an enemy. She saw a geometry problem to be solved, a question of physics that had a very simple, brutal answer. "They are too fast for our tracking," her tactical officer said, a note of panic creeping into his voice. Reed smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "We don't need to track them," she replied. "Just fill the space around us with lead. They have to come to us eventually." And so the first defensive layer of the fortress woke up, not with elegant lasers or smart missiles, but with thousands of automated cannons firing millions of steel ball bearings at relativistic speeds. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't advanced. It was a shotgun blast on a cosmic scale, a wall of shrapnel that turned the graceful, needle-like Krell ships into sieves. The Krell had mastered speed and energy, humanity had mastered mass and stubbornness. Inside the Bastion, life was a strange, fascinating mix of military discipline and small-town peace, a paradox that no alien sociologist could ever truly understand. There were parks with artificial sunlight, where real oak trees grown from earth seed stretched their branches in low gravity, their roots held in place by magnetic clamps. There were schools where children learned about the history of a planet called Earth. A blue marble many of them had never stepped on, seeing it only as a distant, protected relic. The city was divided into rings, a circular logic of survival. The outer rings were for defense, a labyrinth of factories churning out munitions, barracks housing soldiers, and repair bays where damage control crews slept in their suits, the inner rings were for the soul of humanity. Libraries containing the sum of all human knowledge, theaters playing 3,000-year-old Shakespeare plays, and gardens where the air smelled of wet soil and roses. Leo was a technician on the cooling floors, a man in his late 30s who had never seen a natural sunrise. His job was to make sure the massive, planet-cracking heat generated by the city's fusion core didn't melt the residential blocks above him. He lived in a small apartment with a view of the Great Canyon, a massive structural gap that ran through the center of the city like a wound, designed to vent thermal stress. From his window, he could see the transport ships moving like silent fireflies between the towering arcologies. To him, the Bastion wasn't a weapon. It was the only world he had ever known, the dirt under his feet and the sky above his head. He knew, in the quiet moments before sleep, that if the Krell broke through, there was nowhere else to go, there was no fallback plan. The social structure of the Bastion was unique, forged in the fire of necessity. Every citizen had a role in the defense, not just as a worker, but as a combatant. Even the bakers were trained in emergency medical response, even the teachers were experts in damage control and vacuum seal protocols. It was a society built for war, but not for the love of it. They fought because they wanted to keep their way of life, to preserve the taste of coffee and the sound of a child's laugh. The Krell couldn't understand this. They thought the humans were slaves to their fortress, trapped and forced to fight. They didn't realize that the fortress was the humans' greatest act of freedom, the freedom to exist on their own terms, to refuse extinction with every bolt and weld. The Krell, realizing they were dealing with an anomaly, brought their heavy hitters. These were not the sleek needles of the vanguard, these were ships the size of mountains, ugly, scarred leviathans designed for one purpose, to crack planets open like eggs. They surrounded the Bastion at Orion's gate, a strategic bottleneck in the stars where the gravity wells of 3 dead stars created a narrow passage. It was a trap, and the Bastion was the mouse. The battle lasted for 3 weeks without a single moment of silence. The Bastion's shields, a bubble of distorted spacetime, were glowing a constant, angry white from the pressure of the Krell's suncracker beams. But the fortress held. It wasn't just metal and energy, it was the sheer, stubborn will of 10 million people who refused to move, who had decided that this spot in the void was worth dying for. Admiral Reed, watching the power readings fluctuate, initiated the Iron Rain protocol. The Bastion stopped firing its cannons, ceasing all offensive output. Instead, it began to vent its atmosphere in controlled, explosive bursts, spewing frozen oxygen, water vapor, and shredded debris into the space around it. This created a thick, obscuring cloud that acted as a physical barrier against the Krell's energy-based lasers, scattering their light and diffusing their heat. Then, out of the cloud, the human Wasp ships emerged. These weren't beautiful or elegant. They were desperation made manifest, a single cockpit strapped to a massive, overpowered engine and 2 heavy, armor-piercing guns. They had no shields, no hyperdrive, and barely any life support. They didn't need to survive the trip back. They just needed to get close enough to the Krell hulls to punch a hole. It was suicide, and the pilots lined up for the chance. The Krell flagship, the Star Eater, finally engaged. It fired a beam of dark energy, an exotic particle stream that bypassed conventional matter, that actually managed to punch through the first 3 layers of the Bastion's armor. For the first time, alarms rang in the residential sectors, a high-pitched shriek that cut through the A section of the city the size of a neighborhood, a full 20,000 people and their homes, was instantly vented to the vacuum, flash frozen in the silent dark. But instead of panicking, instead of rioting, the humans simply sealed the bulkheads, rerouted life support, and kept fighting. The loss didn't break them, it only made them angrier, more focused. In the central hub, Admiral Reed watched a screen showing the hull breach. Her face was stone. Then, she gave the order that no one expected. The Bastion's maneuvering thrusters fired, not to run away, but to push the massive fortress forward. It was going to ram the flagship. The Krell had never seen anything like it. Their entire military doctrine was based on speed and evasion. The idea of a spaceborne city turning itself into a kinetic projectile was an act of insane, illogical courage. The secret of the Bastion, however, wasn't just its armor or its guns or its stubborn population. It was the core. Deep in the absolute center of the city, buried under miles of rock and lead, was a piece of technology humanity had found in the ruins of a dead civilization, a civilization that had mastered gravity before being wiped out by a supernova. It was a gravity anchor, a sphere of pulsating, silver light that didn't just provide power for the city. It allowed the Bastion to manipulate the fabric of spacetime around it, to bend gravity like a lens. As the fortress closed in on the Star Eater, the core began to hum, a deep, subsonic thrum that vibrated in the bones of everyone on board. Space began to bend, to warp. The Krell ships, so reliant on precise navigational arrays, found that their controls no longer worked. They were being pulled into the Bastion, not by a tractor beam, but by a gravity well, like iron filings drawn to a magnet. They smashed into the Bastion's hull or collided with each other, crushed by the weight of their own mass multiplied 1,000-fold. Inside the core room, engineers in heavy radiation suits were screaming over the comms, pushing the machine to its absolute breaking point. If the core failed, the city wouldn't just lose power. It would collapse into a micro-black hole, erasing the entire Orion Arm from existence. If it worked, they would win the war. It was a gamble that only humans would take. The Krell, for all their ancient wisdom, valued their individual lives too much to risk everything on a single, untested machine. Humans, however, had nothing left to lose but their home. The final day of the war arrived not with a bang, but with a sudden, haunting silence. The gravitational anchor had torn a hole in the Krell formation, and the remaining Krell ships, their command structure in shambles and their will to fight obliterated, fled into the deeper void, leaving behind their pride, their heavy hitters, and their dead. The Bastion stood alone in the wreckage, a dark silhouette against the distant glow of a nebula. Its lights were flickering, running on emergency reserves, but they were still burning. It was scarred, broken in a dozen places, venting atmosphere from wounds that wouldn't heal for years, and listing slightly to port. But it was still there. Humanity had survived. The galaxy, which had looked at the weak, slow race from Earth with condescension, would never look at them the same way again. The cleanup took years. The Bastion itself became a massive shipyard, using the salvaged metal from the destroyed Krell ships to repair its own wounds and, more importantly, to build even more fortresses. Humanity had learned that the universe was a dangerous place, and they intended to be the most dangerous thing in it. Other alien races, the observers who had watched the battle from afar, sent ambassadors not to conquer, but to learn. They wanted to know how a stationary city could defeat a mobile empire. Admiral Reed, now retired and living in a quiet apartment overlooking the Great Canyon, told them the same thing every time, her voice soft but unyielding. We didn't build a city for war. We built a city for peace. And we were willing to do anything to keep it. In the end, the Bastion didn't just save Earth, it changed the stars. It became neutral ground, a galactic Switzerland, a place where all races, the avian ruck, the crystalline shard, the watery deep walkers, could meet under the protection of human iron. The floating fortress was no longer a secret weapon, it was a monument to an idea. The idea that no matter how small you are, no matter how fast your enemy is, if you stand your ground, if you refuse to be moved, you can shift the entire universe. The story of the Bastion was passed down through generations, a whispered legend on 1,000 worlds. A reminder that humanity's greatest strength isn't our ability to destroy, which is impressive, but our flat-out, stubborn, irrational, and glorious refusal to be destroyed. The Bastion still floats, a city of iron and will, waiting for the next problem to solve, the next fight to win, the next day to simply live. And inside, a technician named Leo is drinking his coffee, watching the fireflies dance between the towers, and feeling the slight vibration of a war that ended long ago, content in the knowledge that the shield held. The universe is vast, cold, and mostly silent. But it is silent because humanity has learned to keep it that way, one continent-sized fortress at a time.